Gentlemen, our distinguished third keynote speaker will speak on education and social development, the international strategies for economies collaboration reform. The World Bank lead of its Global Solutions Group on tertiary education and has served on advisory boards and committees, including the International Association of Universities, the American Council on Education's Commission, NAFSA, World Education Services, and the Center for Internationalization of Higher Education at UNICAT, Milan, Italy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome, representing India, Dr. Francisco Marmolejo from Mexico. Por favor, gracias.
Thank you very much.
Terima kasih. Gracias.
Thank you very much. I know this time of the day is a very difficult time to listen to a boring presentation. And so I will try to do my best not to make it as boring as you may think. But probably I may start by telling you about someone who was invited to give a lecture one day. And when he arrived to the lecture hall, he realized that there was only one person there to listen to his presentation. So he kept wondering, what do I do? There is only one person. I was expecting 200 people here, and there is only one. So after a while, he decides to give the lecture, despite the fact that there is only one attendee. And then, however, in the middle of the presentation, he couldn't resist the temptation. And then he said, he interrupted the lecture, and then he said, "Sir, I'm interested in knowing why you are the only person who was interested in my topic." And then the response of the only attendee was, "Really, I'm not interested in your topic, but I was asked to close the door when you finish." So this afternoon, I'm very pleased that there are a good number of you which are willing to close the door once the session is over. So thank you very much, first of all, to the government of Malaysia and the Ministry of Higher Education for the kind invitation to join this important conversation this afternoon. I'd like to recognize especially the Honorable Deputy Minister and the Honorable Secretary General of the Ministry of Higher Education for their presence here. I had the pleasure of being in Malaysia last year in a fourth industrial revolution event, and I should tell you that I was, and I'm still very, very impressed with the significant development that government and institutions of higher education in Malaysia have been doing as they address the challenges of the fourth industrial revolution. So this afternoon, my presentation is about the topic of fostering educational and social development and what is the role of higher education institutions in the fourth industrial revolution era. So just to start, I think it is important to make the point about the fact that significant changes had been experienced in the world and that we have no choice in today's world but to think out of the conventional, to think out of the traditional in trying to understand what are those challenges for us and in which way that will dramatically affect higher education in the world. So we have in this session two parts. The easy one for me, which is talking about the problems, and then the not very easy for the panelists in the further session in which they will talk about the solutions. So basically I will outline some of those challenges. So, and then that it matters because again, we need to think and to see the world and to see the conditions of higher education, again, a little bit out of the traditional and the conventional. Who told us that the North is in the North and the South is in the South? All depends on the way that we are seeing the world. And this is the invitation that all of us always have to be taking in consideration as we think about the role of higher education in fostering social changes and social development. It is, for sure, a very different context in which we no longer can see higher education from the perspective of the traditional ivory tower. So a typical question that all of us are having to address is if higher education is a good investment. And of course, the evidence is there. From an economic standpoint, for instance, in the World Bank, we conduct a periodic analysis of what are the economic returns on education. And we know, it is a fact, that the average rate of return per every single year of schooling is about 10% of extra revenues that an individual will have on his or her life cycle as they progress. In other words, 1 year of studies, 10% extra income in your lifetime. But when we dissect the information by levels of the educational system, the interesting news is that higher education is the subsector of the entire educational system where we observe the highest economic returns. In other words, from an economic standpoint, it makes a lot of sense to invest in higher education. However, there are some challenges associated with that. The first one, for instance, is that even though returns, economic returns in education are the highest ones in higher education, that happens not in all the regions of the world. In fact, it is challenging to observe that in the Middle East and Northern Africa, the economic returns for higher education are even lower than in the previous levels of education. Another challenging issue is that, believe it or not, returns or economic returns are starting to decline. And that may be due to two potential reasons. One is that probably in many countries, the supply of higher education graduates may be going beyond what the economy is able to absorb. Or second, because the graduates of the higher education institutions probably are not having the right skills that are being demanded in the economy and society. And for that matter, then there might be a potential sort of punishment, if you want, in terms of not providing enough economic premium for the ones who have a diploma because they don't have the skills that they are supposed to have and that are supposed to be demanded. So even the ones having access to higher education, there are many cases that probably you may know that not always are reaping the benefits of higher education. So let me tell you the case of Angelo. It is a guy that I met recently in India. He is an economist, but he never had been able to work as an economist, even though he was properly trained to serve as an economist. Now, he is a tourist guide, and he enjoys his work. However, he always shares his frustration for the fact that probably what he learned in the higher education institutions was not what he needed in order to become viable from an economic standpoint, if you want. And we may see many Angelos in different parts of the world of individuals who already have a diploma, but are unfortunately are unable to develop their full potential because something didn't work. Even we see in other parts of the world the situation of the case in which what a family is investing in higher education is not providing enough returns. You can see in the case of Chile in South America here, how, for instance, the graduates of humanities programs, 45% of them will have negative economic returns to their higher education investment. In other words, what it costs to them to study, when they graduate, they will not have enough salary even to pay for the investment that it was made by themselves or by their families or even though by society. And you can see in the case, for instance, of education, in which 60% of the graduates of the technical degree in education won't have, again, enough revenues in their life to pay for the investment that it was made on them.
Those are some of the dysfunctionalities, I might say, of our higher education system that need to be addressed because it happens globally, not only in some countries that I already mentioned to you, but in different parts of the world. So the question is if higher education is being affected or not by the ramifications of the fourth industrial revolution. It would be very naive for us to think that it is not affecting higher education, that the fourth industrial revolution is something that is happening outside of our colleges and universities, that nothing will change in our institutions because nothing has changed for many years. I think it would be very naive. We need to embrace that reality and to think on not only how we should modify the way we are teaching, the way we are conducting research, but also the way we act as corporate citizens in our respective communities. So think about the fact that probably some of the jobs that exist today may no longer exist in future years. I was surprised to read recently, for instance, this analysis made by a group of researchers which predict that there is a 50% probability that in about 30 years, the profession of surgeon will disappear. And you might think, well, no, that's totally nonsense. Surgeons will exist forever. Probably. But probably their job is going to change. In fact, recently I was visiting a place in southern India, in Kerala, and at the airport I found this ad. And basically in the fine letters it says, the Da Vinci surgical robot in our hospital has completed over 780 surgeries in multiple specialties in just 2 years. So probably the profession of surgeon may be disappearing in future years. And it is happening now. The impact of that in what we teach, we learn, how do we teach, how do we learn, and how do we conduct research in our institutions probably is shifting, and we better pay attention to that. And the most important factor, which is basically the topic of the next panel, is that all of that stuff is not only about money. It is not only about economic returns. Higher education is much more than that. Higher education is the key enabler of social development. And we shouldn't lose that perspective. Because if we just think about the money, probably we are going to be thinking about preparing informed robots. But we shouldn't forget that at the end of the day, higher education is about building citizenship, preparing the cadre of the next thinkers and leaders of our societies, regardless of the country in which we live. If we don't forget about that, probably we will make the case about the need for higher education institutions to go beyond the traditional. It is not about money. More important is the fact that higher education provides significant social benefits. We know, for instance, from an economic standpoint, that higher education is the main factor of social mobility. We know, for instance, that the kids in families where someone, the father, most of the time the mother, has higher education studies, most likely those kids will have higher education studies. So that is a significant factor. We know that higher education builds informed citizens. We know that more education leads to more awareness of what happens in your community, to healthier and longer lives, to individuals more tolerant. All those are elements of the benefits of higher education that sometimes we don't pay too much attention to, as we are highly concerned just with the money, just with the economic side. We know that individuals graduating from higher education institutions are much more conscious of the environment. What is the impact that that has in our societies? Huge. In the World Bank, we conduct every year a study, which is the World Development Report. And this year's report was fully dedicated to education. In fact, it was the first time in the history of the World Bank that the report for development is about education. And from that, I just extracted just one or two slides. The report is available at the website of the World Bank. But basically, those are the ones who, among other things, inform about the social benefits of higher education. For instance, the percentage of population that believes that democracy is important in our societies, it shows very clearly that individuals with higher education studies, which is the blue dot, have much more level of understanding of the importance of democracy in our societies than the ones who don't have higher education studies. Sorry. Here we go. Healthier lives. You know, this is a copy of just one of the many reports that exist that shows that individuals with graduate studies, with studies in higher education, tend to live at least 5 years more than the ones who don't finish high school. Other example, we know that higher education, this is from the South Africa Ministry of Higher Education, showing that, you know, higher education is the last place in our formal education system where we have the opportunity to build tolerance and awareness in our future citizens of our societies. Let me show you the case of my own country, Mexico, where you can, it is in Spanish, so you can practice your Spanish, right? So basically it shows, you know, the unwillingness of people to accept different people. Let's say the unwillingness to accept someone with a discapacity, or the unwillingness to accept someone from another race, or another religion, or another country. And you can see clearly that the ones who have only elementary education tend to be less tolerant, and the section where you find the more tolerant people is in the individuals who have already higher education studies. And all of us is part of the social development role of higher education institutions. It is not only about money. And of course, the lack of knowledge, understanding, information, and education leads to individuals which are ignorant from others and intolerant to others. And again, this is just an example of a map of the world, according to the US, in which they show that Mexico, my own country, for instance, is the country of tequila. And which is not true. We do more things. Now, recently, I go to places in which they tell me that Mexico is also a country of narcos. I say, okay, so another stereotype of my own country. But again, I think the point that I'm trying to make is that higher education is the last resort where we can provide to the future citizens of our society that capacity to understand the otherness, the awareness of other individuals. So there is, we like it or not, a renewed role for higher education. We need to find ways in order to have higher education institutions that provide opportunity for individuals to be both globally mandated, but at the same time, locally engaged. To be the ones who understand what is happening in the world, but that on the day-to-day work, they are being responsible citizens of the communities where they live. And this is a very important role of higher education institutions. And at the same time, it is required for higher education institutions to act more as a role model, global corporate citizens in the communities in which they live. So this is part of the moral responsibility of higher education institutions. The good news is that the current and the future environment is a very fertile line for more and better higher education. Just by seeing all the demographics of the world, that is very clear. But the challenging news is that we have no clue of how this dramatic transformation that our society is experiencing is going to impact higher education. And it looks like not too many people are really concerned about. That's why coming to a place like Malaysia and having this conversation in the Islamic world about the importance of higher education, I think it is a great, refreshing perspective, because at least the ones which are sitting here are concerned about that, and that means a big difference. We know that more than ever, more people are having access to higher education globally. This is the good news. The global enrollment in higher education will continue growth in future years just because the demographics of the world. The not very good news is that unfortunately access to higher education is not becoming a viable opportunity to all. In fact, there are some countries in the world in which the numbers really don't help. Malaysia is doing very well, but other countries are not. Look at, for instance, the case of the low-income countries, where you can observe that despite efforts, still just a few on those societies are being benefiting from higher education, and all the relationship associated with higher economic benefits and, more important, higher social benefits to the communities in which they are. And unless we break that trend of marginalization, of course it is going to be very difficult to enable a much more equal global society. And that is a big responsibility of higher education institutions, government, employers, and of course, the ones who benefited from higher education. We like it or not, higher education still is a privilege for a few. Look at this chart showing the big difference between access to higher education in the richest quintile of our communities and access to higher education in the poorest quintile. It is not fair. Some are benefiting. All of us which are sitting here, all of us have benefited from that, but there are many outside of this room which are not in many countries. And for them, we have a responsibility because they had exactly the same right we had, but for whatever reason, they didn't have the same privilege. So there are still significant disparities in access, especially in rural areas, women, poor people, people from socially disadvantaged communities, and for them we have to do something. And as we see the way the world is evolving, and the fact that societies are aging all over the world, with the exception of a few countries, including India, of course it is going to be a big challenge for future years. As population growth will evolve differently in the world, and there will be some regions of the world which are going to be even diminishing or reducing their size of the population, and others will continue growing, especially the case of Africa, where there will be a significant increase in population and, for that matter, in youth. Unless we address these problems from a global standpoint, we won't recognize the fact that the demographic shift that the world is going to be facing will represent both an opportunity for the world, an opportunity for some societies in the world, but at the same time, still a significant challenge as of today. There will be, no matter what, a brutal pressure for talent in future years. And again, a significant actor in that process is going to be precisely higher education. Unfortunately, still today, we live in a very unequal world, and we shouldn't forget about that. It is a very important role of higher education to recognize that those faces are not the faces of higher education, but we need to make sure that every single graduate of our institution recognizes that it is also their challenge. Those are some distant realities. You like it one or the other? And those distant realities, you may decide where do you want to live, here or here. And sometimes that reality is not really distant, but is right in front of each other, as you can see on this picture from Sao Paulo in Brazil. So it is an unequal world, and again, if there is someone who should take this seriously, is the higher education sector, because it is the sector of the informed and educated citizens in our communities. And if we are unable to change that, I doubt that somebody else will be able to do it. So our responsibility in higher education, as Stefan Kreisel says, it is the fact that in the 21st century, we are facing a massive change in the way that our society is being shaped, and that we as society need to make the commitment to guide our technologies in a responsible way in order to benefit greater numbers of our population. Otherwise, we won't be creating the opportunities for all and just for a lucky few, as probably currently may exist. So higher education, as we know, not always works as a system. In fact, there are many who complain that higher education institutions tend to become a little bit distant from relevant actors in our communities with which we need to embrace more. And that's why this discussion that we are having these 2 days precisely is very hopeful, because you are bringing together people from outside of the universities, which express commitment to work with universities in order to resolve the challenges of society. So we need to recognize that there is a lot of room for improvement there, that we need to connect more our higher education institutions with society, that we need to connect more our higher education institutions with other higher education institutions, and also that we need to connect more our higher education institutions even inside our higher education institutions. Because we have the tendency to create silos in our higher education institutions that don't connect each other. And that is a big challenge for everybody. And I can tell you that because all my life I have worked in higher education. Still, I am a faculty member in my university with a leave of absence in order to work at the World Bank. But I see that as a big challenge that we have seen for many years. And communities are large, we like it or not, are skeptical, are unconvinced, and sometimes are a little bit impatient about the need for higher education to become more responsive to needs. Look at these headlines of newspapers from different parts of the world that basically tell that we in higher education institutions have a lot of things to do in order to become more transparent, more accountable, and much more open to the challenges of society in which we are located. And this is something that, again, we need to address, we like it or not. There are many books, even movies, criticizing what happens in higher education institutions and on this need for higher education institutions to become a little bit out of the ivory tower. Those are some changing social and individual perceptions about the university that we, again, need to address. So a key trend, and I will finish with this, because as I mentioned before, my role is really relatively easy because I just talk about the problems, because the panel will talk about the solutions. But a key trend in today's world is that there is a significant questioning about the quality and the relevance of higher education. There is a questioning about what students are learning and how different is that from the realities of the outside world, and in which way we need to recognize that probably something is not working well. So this is a study that we conducted about 4 years ago regarding the gap between what employers perceive it is important and what higher education institutions perceive it is important. And you may find some of the issues that are there that probably we don't teach formally in our higher education institutions. Do we teach about integrity, reliability, flexibility, empathy, as some of the issues that have been mentioned by the previous speakers? We assume that students learn that by osmosis, but not because there is a conscious effort in our institutions to really teach those skills, which are going to be fundamental skills for them, not only as professionals, but more important, as the future citizens of our society. So there are consequently some pointers for action, both for government, for industry, for higher education institutions. That's why I should tell you, as an outsider of Malaysia, that is, again, very refreshing to see what it is happening here. And for the colleagues who come from other countries, I recommend you to take a look to, for instance, the Malaysia Education Blueprint, the 2015 to 2025 sort of strategic thinking about the future of higher education in this country. We are using, in fact, personally, I'm using that as a case in point when I talk about innovation in higher education in different parts of the world. So, for instance, I'm very intrigued among the many actions that the government of Malaysia is putting in place. I'm very intrigued specifically about some of them. This one, for instance, the integrated cumulative grade point average. You know, it is fascinating to see that it is not only the traditional grade that a student receives, which has been valued. Because that the grade, as you know, it is just a proxy of knowledge, not always the best proxy of knowledge. How do we measure, for instance, the level of adequate skills of students in terms of social responsibility? How do we measure, for instance, the capacity of the students to exercise ethics and values? How do we integrate that into the portfolio of skills that a graduate of a higher education institutions will present to society? This is really innovative because we don't see that happening in many parts of the world. We continue thinking that GPA is just a number and that it is a best proxy of someone which probably might be smart, but probably might not be the best individual that society needs. I like other ideas such as the 2U2, which is pushing students to go out of the classroom, or initiatives such as bringing the employers to the classroom. Those are, again, you might think, well, you know, that happens all over the world. Might be the case, but the fact that it's a conscious element embedded into the future strategy of the system, this is something that is really encouraging to see, and for that I'd like to congratulate all of you from Malaysia for that collective work that you are doing, both government as well as higher education institutions, as well as employers. Accreditation of prior learning, experiential learning is another fact that is also very innovative. Not many countries are pushing for that. Again, we know that governments must act, but national levels are not sufficient. We know that higher education institutions need to embrace themselves in that particular change. And we may like to see ourselves probably like that, or let's be very honest and recognize where are the deficiencies and where are the challenges that we need to address. So the ones criticizing higher education say that this was the Italian university in 1350, in which, by the way, you can see somebody which is sleeping there, or somebody may say that he's just meditating. But somebody there is not paying attention to the speaker, although I'm very pleased here that most of you are paying attention to the speaker. But that the universities of today probably didn't change too much. That probably we changed a little bit of the clothing and the technology and everything else, but we continue repeating probably a very traditional pattern in which basically the one who knows, the teacher, is spreading knowledge and wisdom to the ones who don't, which are the students. And in today's world, many times it looks like the students more know than the teachers, especially in technology. So again, that is a potential challenge that we need to address. So the ones criticizing higher ed said that we are very good in higher education to exercise the art of ambiguity, which is continuing doing the same, but expecting different results. That we are very good in higher education to blame others about the problems that we have in higher education. And there is no higher education institutions where you can speak with people and may tell you that the graduates of high schools are pretty bad. And then you go to a high school and they will say, you know, the graduates of secondary school are pretty bad. And then you continue blaming each other while instead of saying, you know, this is our problem, collective problem that all of us should address. So the paradox is that higher education institutions are the best laboratory for social change, but at the same time, they have the tendency to inhibit their innovation capacity. So there is no magic formula, but it may work in one place, may not work in other cases, but I think recognizing the context changing that higher education is facing is fundamental to recognize that opportunities are ahead. That's why I believe that the role of WACAF in creating an enabling environment that connects more effectively teaching, research, and public service, it is something that it is not only desirable, but more important, I think it is needed. And that requires the collective wisdom and involvement of the different actors that make of higher education a reality. We need to change the paradigm. We may think that that is a good idea, but is too distant from our higher education institutions, and it is a priority for tomorrow. I think we need to think about a critical need. It is something too close to home. It is an essential part of higher education, And it is a priority not for tomorrow, not even for today. It was a priority for yesterday. I just will finish with this quote from Paul Valéry, who said that the trouble with our times is that the future is not what it used to be. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'm sure that the participants in the panel now will talk about the most important, which is the solutions to this challenging environment. Thank you.
Terima kasih, thank you. We are quite behind time, ladies and gentlemen. Minta maaf ya, masa dah kurang, saya terpaksa teruskan acara, kalau tidak kita lambat nanti untuk acara seterusnya.
I don't know if we have time. Do we have time?
And not the statement, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I see here 3 questions, and I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Microphone, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Nick Yusuf from Islamic Chamber of Commerce, Malaysia. Well, I don't have a question, but I have a statement to make. When you say that it is about flexibility among the undergraduates who, with regards to employability. So my suggestion is, well, I think I'm a bit rash here, but please, they need to rewire their mind. Because to rewire the mind of their thinking culture is necessary. Because why should they think of being employed, whereas they should be the one that should create employment? They are the one that should be self-employed, because it is the world now that is full of technology, full of outcome, full of 401 or 4 IR 4.0. So this is the era of the mind that shouldn't make the students so passive that they need to work for others.
Yeah.
And I think this has to be challenged in the university, meaning that the attitude and character building should be part of the common paper among the students in the university. Yeah. They have to be flexible. And I think I need to raise my voice just to make the point. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your statement. I fully agree with your statement. I think it is, we need to challenge many of the assumptions of the traditional way that we build curriculum in our higher education institutions. As there was no time to develop on this, but in other opportunities, when I have a chance to go on the details on the curriculum, we see very clearly that the type of traditional professions that we are sort of preparing our students for, it is a significant dissonance with what are the realities of the society in which they will be going to be acting. So this idea that we need to change jobs in the future, we need to change professions and we need to change roles, which is, of course, something that is now very evident. So I agree with you. We need to change the mindset of our educators. We need to use more effectively the curriculum. I apologize. And we need to prepare more entrepreneurs and innovators. Okay. Some of the questions here are also related to that. I'd like to pick up only one of them that talks about how higher education institutions can produce social innovators. Again, that it is connected more with what you were describing before. And that, for that matter, we need to navigate a not very easy environment, because many times the assumption about quality of higher education institutions is linked to the word selectivity. Many times the ranking system that exists globally measures quality also based on that element. And unfortunately, as I was describing before, many times the issue of quality associated with selectivity in access automatically takes out from possibilities to individuals who probably were facing difficulties and challenges as they progressed in the educational system, especially people from rural areas or from socioeconomic backgrounds in which they didn't have the same opportunities as the one who had much more privileged educational opportunities. Of course, they will have a handicap as they go to the level of access to higher education. Now, just by saying that higher education institutions should be highly selective and taking out the ones which are not qualified, I think it is socially irresponsible. I think higher education institutions need to make much more aggressive efforts in increasing what I refer to as equality of opportunities. And that requires for us to outreach more to the previous levels of education and to establish adequate bridges with those parts of the educational system in order to make sure that we don't take the easy road by just saying we will become much more quality of higher education institutions, we will just take the best and we will forget about the rest. And I don't think that is socially responsible for all of us. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih. Thank you very much, Dr. Marmolejo. May I call upon the Secretary General of the Ministry of Higher Education, Tan Sri Dr. Nurul Ainur Muhammad Noor, to come on stage to do the honors of presenting a token of appreciation to our third keynote speaker. Dr. Francisco Marmolejo from the World Bank in India, originally from Mexico. Terima kasih, thank you. Muchas gracias. Dhanyawad. Bahut shukriya. Our last and final session for the day, ladies and gentlemen. There are only two panel members and one moderator. The discussion on education and social development. Please welcome on stage Professor Dr. Asma Ismail and Professor Dr. Azmi Omar. On stage, please. And the distinguished moderator is Director for Innovastra Capital Center.